Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that medieval engineers obsessed over, but modern people never consider. What angle should a drawbridge rest at when it's closed? Not fully horizontal, as you might assume, not at the most obvious position. The answer involves physics, psychology, social control, and a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of how small inconveniences shape human behavior. The genius of the drawbridge angle spared iron hinges that would otherwise have shattered under repeated stress, but that same angle also changed how people walked, how they thought about entering fortified spaces, and how entire communities organized their daily rhythms around the quiet rules that a tilted bridge enforced. This is the story of an engineering decision that became a social institution, and by the end of tonight, you'll never look at a castle entrance the same way again.
The drawbridge is one of those medieval technologies that seems simple until you actually try to build one. 2 chains or ropes, a wooden platform, some hinges, a mechanism to raise and lower it. What could be complicated about that? The answer is everything. Every element of a working drawbridge involves trade-offs and compromises that medieval engineers spent centuries refining. The angle of rest, the position at which the bridge sits when it's down and theoretically allowing passage, was perhaps the most subtle and consequential of these compromises.
A perfectly horizontal drawbridge would be the most convenient for traffic. Carts wouldn't have to climb an incline. Horses wouldn't lose traction on a slope. People wouldn't have to adjust their gait as they crossed. But a perfectly horizontal bridge creates enormous problems for the hinges and the lifting mechanism. When you raise a horizontal bridge, you're fighting gravity at its maximum disadvantage for the entire first portion of the lift. The stress on the hinges at the moment of initial movement is tremendous, and that stress is repeated every single time the bridge operates. Medieval iron couldn't handle it. The hinges would crack, the pins would shear, and the entire mechanism would fail at the worst possible moment, which is to say, when you actually needed to raise the bridge because enemies were approaching.
The solution was to angle the bridge. By setting the rest position at somewhere between 5 and 15 degrees above horizontal, engineers dramatically reduced the initial lifting stress. The physics are straightforward. A bridge at rest at an angle has already begun to rotate around its hinge point. The counterweight or winch mechanism doesn't have to overcome the full moment of inertia from a dead stop. The hinges experience a gentler, more gradual transfer of force. The difference in stress was substantial enough that properly angled bridges lasted decades, while horizontal bridges failed within years.
Before we go deeper into the engineering, let me ask you something. If you're the kind of person who finds yourself watching videos about medieval drawbridge mechanics at whatever hour it happens to be where you are, you appreciate how the small details reveal the big patterns. Take a moment to subscribe if you want more of these stories where engineering meets social history, and tell me in the comments what time it is where you're watching. I'm genuinely curious whether the people who appreciate drawbridge angles are night owls or early risers.
Now, here's where the story gets interesting. The engineers who developed angled drawbridges were solving a mechanical problem. But the angle they chose had social consequences they may not have fully anticipated. An inclined bridge changes how people approach a fortification. It forces them to walk uphill, which is slower and more tiring than walking on level ground. It makes them visible to guards above for a longer period. It puts them at a psychological disadvantage, looking up at walls and towers that loom larger as the incline raises their sightline. The angle that spared the hinges also tilted the social relationship between those inside the walls and those seeking entry.
This wasn't accidental, at least not entirely. Medieval architects understood the psychology of approach.
The entire design vocabulary of castle architecture involves creating psychological pressure on visitors. Narrow passages that force single-file movement, murder holes overhead, arrow slits watching from every angle. The inclined drawbridge was part of this vocabulary. It communicated through physical experience rather than words that entry was a privilege granted by those inside. You climbed to enter. You approached as a supplicant, not an equal. The angle encoded social hierarchy into the very act of crossing.
Let me introduce you to a specific drawbridge that illuminates these principles, one whose records have survived in unusual detail. The drawbridge at Bodiam Castle in Sussex, England, was constructed in the 1380s as part of a defensive system that was already somewhat old-fashioned for its time. Bodiam was built by Sir Edward Dallingridge, a knight who had made his fortune in the French wars and wanted a residence that looked impressively martial, even if its actual defensive capabilities were secondary to its symbolic ones. The drawbridge was central to this symbolism. Archaeological and documentary evidence suggests that Bodiam's drawbridge rested at approximately 8 degrees above horizontal. This angle was carefully chosen to balance mechanical requirements with practical use. At 8 degrees, a loaded cart could still cross without excessive difficulty, but the incline was noticeable. Visitors approaching Bodiam had to climb, however slightly, to reach the gatehouse. The household accounts from Dallingridge's time include payments for maintaining the drawbridge mechanism, and the frequency of these payments suggests that even at the optimized angle, the stress on the system was significant.
The operational routine at Bodiam reveals how the drawbridge angle shaped daily life. The bridge was lowered at dawn and raised at dusk, a rhythm that defined the castle's relationship with the surrounding community. But the angled rest position meant that the bridge was never fully open in the welcoming sense. Even when down, it presented a climb. Merchants bringing goods, peasants paying rents, visitors seeking audience, all of them had to ascend to enter. The angle was a permanent reminder that Bodiam was a fortified space, that entry was conditional, that the lord inside held the power to raise this bridge at any moment and seal himself away.
The quiet rules that emerged around the drawbridge were never formally codified, but they were universally understood. You didn't linger on the bridge. You didn't stop to have conversations. You crossed promptly and purposefully, because the bridge might be raised at any moment, and you didn't want to be the person caught in the middle. These behavioral norms weren't enforced by guards, at least not usually. They were enforced by the architecture itself, by the angle that made standing still uncomfortable and moving forward the natural choice.
The implications for commerce were significant. Medieval castles were economic centres as much as military ones, with markets, courts, and administrative functions that required regular traffic. The drawbridge controlled this traffic not through outright prohibition, but through subtle friction. The angle added seconds to every crossing. Those seconds accumulated across hundreds of crossings per day. The time cost was real, and it shaped decisions about when to visit, how often to come, how long to stay. The drawbridge became a form of time taxation, extracting small payments of effort from everyone who used it.
The effect on horses and carts was more pronounced than the effect on pedestrians. A horse climbing an incline while pulling a loaded cart experiences significantly more strain than the same horse on level ground. Merchants learned to time their deliveries carefully, arriving when their horses were fresh rather than at the end of a long journey. The angle of the drawbridge influenced trade schedules across entire regions as cart routes were planned around the physical demands of castle approaches. There's a document from the 14th century, a complaint lodged with the lord of a castle in Burgundy, whose name I'll translate as Château de Roche,
that explicitly mentions the drawbridge angle as a grievance. The local Merchants' Guild argued that the castle's bridge was set too steeply, that it was damaging their horses and their carts, and that the Lord should be required to re-engineer the approach. The Lord's response, also preserved, is a masterpiece of bureaucratic deflection. He argues that the angle is necessary for the defence of the region, that changing it would compromise security, and that the merchants should simply use smaller carts or stronger horses. The dispute went on for years without resolution.
What makes this document fascinating isn't just the complaint itself, but what it reveals about how people understood the drawbridge angle. The merchants didn't question that the angle served defensive purposes. They understood the mechanical logic. Their argument was about degree. They claimed the angle was steeper than necessary, that it exceeded the requirements of engineering and entered the territory of deliberate inconvenience. The Lord's response didn't deny this interpretation. He simply asserted his right to inconvenience them in the name of security. The angle was a tool of social control, and both parties knew it.
The development of drawbridge technology over the medieval period shows engineers continuously refining the balance between mechanical requirements and social effects. Early medieval drawbridges were often simple and crude, with steep angles that reflected limited engineering knowledge. As techniques improved, the angles became more sophisticated, calculated to achieve specific effects with minimum structural stress. By the 14th and 15th centuries, master builders had accumulated enough collective knowledge to specify bridge angles with remarkable precision, adjusting them based on the expected traffic load, the weight of the bridge itself, and the desired social atmosphere of the approach.
The counterweight systems that operated medieval drawbridges deserve examination because they interacted with the angle in important ways. The most common design used a pivoting beam with the bridge on one end and a heavy counterweight on the other. When the bridge was down, the counterweight was up, stored energy ready to be released. When the operators pulled their ropes or turned their winches, the counterweight fell and the bridge rose. The angle of rest affected how much energy the counterweight needed to store and how quickly it could release that energy. A steeper angle meant that the counterweight could be lighter because it didn't have to overcome as much initial resistance. But a steeper angle also meant that the bridge rose faster in its initial movement, which could be dangerous if anyone was still crossing. The ideal angle balanced these factors. Enough inclination to reduce hinge stress and counterweight requirements, but not so much that the bridge's operation became hazardous. Finding this ideal was partly science and partly craft, with master builders passing down rules of thumb that encoded generations of accumulated experience. The chains that connected bridge to counterweight were themselves engineering marvels. Each link had to withstand enormous stress, and a single weak link could cause catastrophic failure. The angle of the bridge affected the angle at which the chains pulled, which affected the distribution of stress along the chain's length. Blacksmiths who specialized in drawbridge chains developed specific techniques for creating links that could handle the particular stress patterns the different bridge angles created. This specialization was valuable enough that such smiths could command premium wages and were sometimes enticed from one lord's service to another's.
The timber of the bridge platform itself was affected by the angle. Wood swells and contracts with moisture, and a bridge that sat at an angle drained differently than a horizontal one. Rain and snow would run off an angled bridge rather than pooling on its surface. This reduced rot and extended the bridge's lifespan, another benefit of the inclined design. Some bridges were deliberately constructed with a slight crown, higher in the center than at the edges, to further improve drainage. The combination of overall angle and surface crown created complex water flow patterns that builders learned to predict and manage. Let me tell you about a specific incident that illustrates how the drawbridge angle functioned during an actual threat. In 1403, the same year Thomas of Bridgenorth was learning to sleep in his boots at Caerphilly, a castle in the Welsh marches called Wigmore experienced what the records describe as a sudden alarm. A force of Welsh rebels was reported approaching, and the garrison had to make the castle ready for possible assault in minimal time. The drawbridge at Wigmore was one of the largest in the region, spanning a dry moat that was perhaps 30 feet wide.
The account of this incident, written by a clerk who was present, mentions that the drawbridge was raised with great speed and smoothness, taking only the time needed for 3 paternosters to move from fully down to fully up. 3 paternosters is perhaps 45 seconds, an impressive speed for raising several tons of timber across a 30-foot span. The clerk attributes this speed to the cunning angle at which the bridge rested, which he claims allowed the counterweight to find its balance quickly at the start of the lift. The engineering details are vague, but the point is clear. The angle was understood as contributing to defensive readiness, not just mechanical longevity.
The rebels at Wigmore, as it turned out, never actually attacked. They were probing, testing responses, looking for weak points. When they saw the drawbridge rise so quickly, they apparently concluded that this castle was too well prepared to be worth the cost of assault. The drawbridge angle had contributed to deterrence without a single arrow being loosed. This is the quiet power of good engineering. It prevents problems rather than solving them, makes conflicts unnecessary rather than winning them. The rebels went elsewhere, and Wigmore remained untaken.
The psychological effect on defenders is also worth considering. A garrison that knows its drawbridge can be raised quickly feels more confident than one that worries about mechanical failures. The smooth operation at Wigmore wasn't just about physical speed, it was about the confidence that speed created. The defenders knew their equipment worked. They trusted their engineers. They could focus on the tactical situation rather than worrying about whether the bridge would jam at the crucial moment. The angle that spared the hinges also spared the defenders' anxiety.
This brings us to a broader point about medieval engineering that the drawbridge exemplifies. Modern people sometimes imagine medieval builders as primitive, working with crude tools and limited knowledge. The reality is more complex. Medieval engineers had accumulated centuries of practical experience. They might not have had calculus or physics textbooks, but they had rules of thumb that encoded the same principles. A master builder specifying a drawbridge angle was drawing on generations of trial and error, on techniques refined across thousands of constructions. The angle he chose represented collective wisdom, not individual guesswork.
The transmission of this wisdom happened through apprenticeship and guild systems. A young man learning the builder's trade would spend years watching masters work, absorbing their methods, memorizing their rules. The rule for drawbridge angles would be taught alongside hundreds of other rules: how deep to dig foundations, how thick to make walls, how to calculate the thrust of an arch. These rules weren't written in textbooks. They lived in the hands and eyes and memories of working craftsmen, passed from generation to generation through practice rather than reading. When a guild of builders lost too many masters too quickly, through plague or war or simple bad luck, the loss could be catastrophic. The knowledge those masters carried died with them, and their apprentices, not yet fully trained, couldn't reconstruct it from first principles. There are cases in the historical record where building quality declined noticeably after such losses, where techniques that had been routine became difficult or impossible. The drawbridge angle, along with countless other engineering details, depended on living memory for its preservation. We've established the mechanical and social foundations of the drawbridge angle, but we've only begun to explore its implications.
In Part 2, we'll examine how the angle changed as drawbridge designs evolved, how different cultures approached the same engineering problem, and how the quiet rules of the drawbridge shaped community habits in ways that persisted long after the bridges themselves fell into ruin. The story of the drawbridge angle is ultimately a story about how physical constraints become social norms, how engineering decisions become cultural institutions, how the tilt of a platform can tilt the balance of power.
The bridge is still tilted. Let's see where it leads.
The drawbridge at Chateau Gaillard, Richard the Lionheart's masterpiece fortress in Normandy, was said to have been set at precisely 12 degrees. This steeper-than-average angle reflected the castle's aggressive defensive posture. Gaillard was built to dominate, to intimidate, to project power across the Seine Valley. The bridge's angle was part of this projection. Anyone approaching Gaillard had to climb visibly, obviously, their effort demonstrating their submission to the power that waited above. Richard reportedly specified this angle personally, understanding that the experience of approach was as important as the strength of walls.
The 12-degree angle at Gaillard created problems that illustrate the trade-offs involved in drawbridge design. The steeper incline wore on horses more quickly, which limited the size of cavalry forces that could efficiently enter or exit the castle. It accelerated erosion of the bridge timbers as traffic concentrated its force on a smaller portion of each plank. And it required more frequent maintenance of the lifting mechanism, which had to work against a sharper initial resistance, despite the theoretical advantages of the inclined rest position. Richard apparently considered these costs acceptable for the psychological impact the angle achieved. Compare this to the bridge at Leeds Castle in Kent, which was set at a much gentler angle, perhaps 5 degrees. Leeds was not primarily a military fortress, but a royal residence, and its drawbridge reflected this different purpose. Visitors to Leeds were meant to feel welcomed, or at least not actively intimidated. The gentle incline allowed easy passage for the elaborate processions and courtly visitors that Leeds frequently hosted. The bridge was still inclined enough to achieve the mechanical benefits, but not so steep as to create the psychological pressure that Gaillard's approach generated. The contrast between Gaillard and Leeds demonstrates that drawbridge angles were chosen, not merely calculated. Engineers could achieve the necessary mechanical benefits across a range of angles. The specific angle selected reflected the intentions of the castle's lord. How much intimidation versus welcome? How much military functionality versus residential comfort? How much raw power versus refined elegance? The drawbridge angle was, in this sense, a form of architectural communication, speaking to visitors before they even reached the gate.
This communicative function becomes clearer when we examine how drawbridge angles changed over time at individual castles. Many fortifications were modified repeatedly across centuries, and their drawbridges often changed along with them. When a castle's primary function shifted from military stronghold to administrative centre, its drawbridge angle sometimes decreased. When threats increased and defence became paramount again, angles sometimes increased. The drawbridge served as a kind of barometer for the castle's orientation towards the outside world.
The records from Kenilworth Castle in Warwickshire show exactly this pattern. In the 13th century, when Kenilworth was a serious military installation, its main drawbridge was set at roughly 10 degrees. In the 14th century, after extensive residential construction transformed the castle into a comfortable noble seat, the bridge was rebuilt at a gentler 7 degrees. Then, during the instability of the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century, the angle was increased again to 9 degrees. Each change reflected a different assessment of what the castle needed to be.
If that pattern of adjustment based on circumstance just gave you a moment of recognition, that sense of understanding how physical structures embody social priorities, that's exactly the kind of insight I hope to share.
The subscribe button is there if you want more of these connections between engineering and social history.
Now let's examine how different cultures approached the same engineering problem, because the physics of drawbridges are universal, but the social contexts varied enormously. Japanese castle design during the Sengoku period featured drawbridges that served similar functions to European ones, but the aesthetic and social values embedded in their design were distinctly different.
Japanese drawbridges, called hikibashi, were typically smaller and lighter than their European counterparts, reflecting the different construction traditions of the two regions. Where European bridges were massive timber platforms designed for heavy cavalry and supply wagons, Japanese bridges were often designed primarily for foot traffic, with wheeled vehicles being much less common. This difference in expected traffic allowed Japanese engineers to use different angles and mechanisms than Europeans employed.
The angle of a hikibashi was often steeper than European bridges, sometimes approaching 15 or even 20 degrees. This steeper angle served multiple purposes. It made the approach more challenging for attackers in armor, it improved drainage in Japan's rainy climate, and it created a more dramatic visual effect as visitors climbed toward the castle gate. The aesthetic dimension was particularly important in Japanese castle design, which placed high value on the visual impressiveness of defensive works.
The social rules around Japanese drawbridges were correspondingly strict. Samurai of different ranks had different protocols for how they could cross, with higher-ranking warriors allowed to cross at any time, while lower ranks had to wait for permission. The steep angle reinforced these hierarchies. Climbing the bridge was a visible act of deference, and those who climbed it were clearly seeking entry rather than asserting right. The angle encoded status distinctions into physical movement.
In the Islamic world, fortress design also featured drawbridges, though the engineering traditions developed somewhat independently. Crusader castles in the Levant show an interesting fusion of European and Islamic approaches, with drawbridges that borrowed from both traditions. The angle choices at these hybrid fortifications often reflected which cultural influence dominated at the time of construction or reconstruction. The castle of Crac des Chevaliers, one of the best preserved Crusader fortifications, features a complex approach with multiple drawbridges at different angles. The outer bridges are relatively gentle, allowing efficient movement of supply trains. The inner bridges, protecting the final defensive positions, are steeper, creating additional obstacles for any attacker who penetrated the outer works. This layered approach, with angle increasing as one moved deeper into the fortress, represented a sophisticated integration of engineering and defensive strategy. The Hospitalier knights who held Crac des Chevaliers developed specific procedures for managing traffic across this system of bridges. Different gates were designated for different types of traffic, one for military movements, one for supplies, one for visitors. Each type of traffic had its own timing and its own rules. The bridge's angles contributed to this differentiation, with steeper bridges naturally limiting themselves to foot traffic, while gentler ones could accommodate wagons. The architecture sorted traffic without requiring constant human supervision. This self-sorting function of angled bridges appears repeatedly in medieval documentation. Castle administrators understood that a steep bridge would discourage casual traffic without requiring anyone to stand at the entrance turning people away. The angle did the work of a guard, constantly, without salary, without breaks, without the possibility of bribery or intimidation. It was a form of automated access control, primitive by modern standards, but remarkably effective within its constraints. The concept of hostile architecture, which modern urban designers use to describe features that discourage certain uses of public space, has deep roots in medieval drawbridge design. A bench with armrests that prevent sleeping, a ledge with spikes that prevent sitting, a sidewalk with bumps that deter skateboarding. All of these use physical design to shape behavior. The angled drawbridge was doing the same thing centuries earlier, using the incline to shape who would approach, how they would approach, and what they would feel as they approached. Let me tell you about a specific individual whose life was shaped by drawbridge angles in ways that illuminate their broader social impact. Her name was Margaret de Lacy, and she was the wife of a minor nobleman in 14th century Ireland. Margaret's household accounts, which survived because they were included in a legal dispute after her death, contain repeated references to the troublesome bridge at her husband's castle. This bridge was apparently set at an unusually steep angle, and Margaret's complaints about it provide a rare window into how medieval women experienced these architectural features.
Margaret notes that she could not cross the bridge in certain shoes, that her ladies-in-waiting had fallen on the incline, that visiting noblewomen complained about the difficulty of navigating it in formal dress. She records requests to her husband to have the bridge rebuilt at a gentler angle, requests that were apparently refused on grounds of defensive necessity. The bridge that protected the castle also constrained the social life within it, limiting what activities could occur, what visitors could be received, what dress could be worn.
Margaret's accounts mention specific incidents: a merchant's wife who refused to visit because of the bridge, a feast that had to be relocated because elderly guests couldn't manage the incline, a delivery of fine cloth that was damaged when the carter's horse slipped on the slope. Each incident was minor in itself, but together they paint a picture of daily life significantly shaped by an engineering decision. The bridge's angle wasn't just a technical specification, it was a constant presence in the household's social and economic activities.
The gendered dimension of Margaret's complaints is worth noting. Medieval women's dress, with its long skirts and impractical shoes, was particularly ill-suited to climbing inclines. The same bridge angle that a man in boots might navigate easily could be genuinely hazardous for a woman in court dress. This meant that steep drawbridge angles effectively limited women's mobility more than men's, creating a gender differential in access that was built into the architecture itself. Margaret's complaints weren't just about convenience. They were about her ability to participate in social life on equal terms with her male counterparts.
The seasonal variation in drawbridge usability added another layer of complexity. A bridge that was manageable in dry summer conditions could become treacherous when covered with rain, ice, or snow. The angle that provided good drainage during storms also created a slippery slope when that drainage left a film of water on the surface. Medieval castle managers developed various solutions, spreading sand or straw for traction, adding cleats or ridges to the bridge surface, even in some cases adjusting the bridge angle seasonally, if the mechanism permitted.
The town of Carnarvon in Wales, dominated by its massive Edwardian castle, developed community practices around the royal drawbridge that persisted for generations. When the bridge was down, it was customary for townspeople to avoid crossing unless they had specific business within the castle. This wasn't a legal requirement, but a social norm. The bridge was understood as belonging to the castle, and using it unnecessary was considered presumptuous. The angle of the bridge reinforced this norm by making casual crossing slightly unpleasant, enough to deter those who didn't have strong reason to make the climb.
The timing of bridge operation created another set of community norms. The drawbridge was typically lowered at dawn and raised at dusk, and everyone in Carnarvon organized their castle-related business around this schedule. If you needed something from the castle, you had to plan your day around the bridge times. If you were inside when the bridge was raised, you stayed inside until morning. This schedule, enforced by the mechanical reality of the drawbridge, imposed a rhythm on the entire community
that shaped work patterns, social gatherings, and commercial activities.
The drawbridge keepers who operated these mechanisms occupied a peculiar social position. They had intimate knowledge of the castle's defensive systems, which made them valuable but also potentially dangerous if their loyalty wavered. They controlled, in a very real sense, who could enter and exit the fortress during the hours of operation. A corrupt or incompetent keeper could compromise the entire defensive scheme. The angle of the bridge affected their work directly. A well-designed angle made operations smooth and quick, while a poorly designed one made it laborious and slow.
Records from various medieval castles mention keeper complaints about bridge mechanisms, and the angle is sometimes explicitly cited. A keeper at Conway Castle in the late 14th century petitioned for an adjustment to the bridge angle, arguing that the existing configuration was wearing upon the chains unduly and would soon cause failure. The petition was granted, and the bridge was rebuilt at a slightly different angle. This kind of incremental refinement, driven by practical experience, was how drawbridge technology improved over time.
The failure modes of drawbridges provide another window into the importance of angle. When a drawbridge failed, it was usually at one of 3 points: the hinges, the chains, or the counterweight mechanism. Hinge failure was often related to excessive stress from improper angles. Chain failure could result from the uneven stress distribution that poor angles created. Counterweight failure sometimes stemmed from the additional force required to operate a bridge whose angle hadn't been optimized. Each failure mode pointed back to angle as a root cause, which is why medieval engineers became increasingly precise in their angle specifications.
The most catastrophic drawbridge failures were those that occurred during actual defensive need. A bridge that jammed halfway up, or whose chain snapped during raising, could doom an entire garrison. The terror of such failures appears in medieval siege accounts, where attackers sometimes specifically targeted bridge mechanisms with fire or projectiles, hoping to disable the defensive system at its most critical point. The angle that allowed quick, reliable operation wasn't just a matter of convenience. It was a matter of survival.
The acoustic properties of drawbridge operation were also affected by angle. A bridge rising or falling produces sounds: the creak of timber, the rattle of chains, the thud of the platform reaching its destination. These sounds travel differently depending on the angle and speed of movement. A quick rising bridge on a steep angle produced a sharp, urgent sound. A slow-moving bridge on a gentle angle produced a more gradual, almost stately sound. Castle residents and nearby townspeople learnt to read these sounds, interpreting the bridge's movement from its acoustic signature.
The sound of the drawbridge rising became, in many communities, a signal with specific meaning. The evening raising meant curfew was approaching. An unexpected raising during the day meant potential danger. The speed of the sound, quick or slow, communicated the urgency of the situation. This acoustic communication extended the drawbridge's influence beyond those who could see it, reaching anyone within earshot and shaping their behavior accordingly. The angle of the bridge, by affecting the speed and character of movement, affected the messages these sounds conveyed.
The transition from medieval drawbridges to later bridge designs shows how the angle principles persisted even as the technology evolved. Bascule bridges, which became common in the early modern period, operated on similar principles of counterweighted rotation. The angles that engineers specified for bascule bridges reflected the same trade-offs that medieval builders had navigated: ease of operation versus stress on components, speed of movement versus safety, convenient rest position versus reliable function. The specific numbers changed, but the underlying engineering logic remained constant.
Even modern movable bridges, operated by hydraulics and electricity rather than counterweights and muscle power, incorporate angle considerations that echo medieval practice. Bridge engineers today calculate optimal angles using computer models, but they're solving the same fundamental equations that medieval masters solved through trial and error. The angle that minimizes stress, speeds operation, and ensures reliability turns out to be remarkably consistent across technologies. Medieval intuition and modern calculation arrive at similar conclusions.
We have explored how the drawbridge angle functioned technically and socially, how it varied across cultures and changed over time, how it shaped individual lives and community practices. In our final part, we'll examine how the quiet rules of the drawbridge persisted after the bridges themselves became obsolete, how the habits of deference and timing encoded in medieval architecture influenced later social forms, and what a genius of the drawbridge angle might teach us about the relationship between physical design and social order. The angle still has lessons to offer if we're willing to climb the slope and listen.
Stay with me. The bridge isn't fully raised yet. The drawbridge at Bodiam Castle hasn't operated in over 500 years. The mechanism is long gone, the chains rusted away, the counterweights disappeared into the mists of history. What remains is a stone platform at the original angle, tilted slightly upward toward the gatehouse, frozen in the position that once allowed the bridge to rise smoothly in defense of the castle. Tourists who visit Bodiam today walk up that incline without thinking about it, their bodies adjusting to the slope as bodies have adjusted for 6 centuries. The bridge is gone, but its angle remains, and that angle still shapes the experience of approach. This persistence of the angle after the mechanism's disappearance illustrates something profound about how physical environments shape behavior. The drawbridge was designed to create a specific experience of entry, a specific relationship between visitor and fortress. When the bridge ceased to function, that design intent remained embedded in the remaining stonework. The slope that was once a mechanical necessity became an architectural feature, and the behavior patterns that slope encouraged continued, even when the original reason for them no longer existed.
Modern Bodiam visitors climb the original approach without any instruction to do so. They don't read a sign explaining the historical significance of the angle. They simply encounter a sloped surface and walk up it, their bodies following the path that medieval engineers laid out. The physical environment teaches them how to behave without any need for explicit communication. This is the quiet power of architecture. It educates through experience rather than explanation, shaping behavior at a level below conscious awareness.
The concept of architectural determinism, the idea that buildings shape the behavior of people who use them, has been debated by scholars for decades. Critics argue that humans are too adaptable, too creative, to be constrained by physical spaces. And it's true that people can and do subvert architectural intentions, using spaces in ways designers never anticipated. But the drawbridge angle shows that architectural determinism doesn't have to be absolute to be significant. The angle didn't force visitors to behave in specific ways, it merely tilted the probabilities, making some behaviors slightly more likely and others slightly less likely. Over thousands of repetitions, that slight tilt accumulated into substantial behavioral patterns. The persistence of these patterns into the present day is remarkable. Many European towns that grew up around medieval castles still show spatial organization that reflects the original drawbridge schedules. The market squares are positioned where medieval people gathered while waiting for the morning bridge lowering. The inn districts are located where travellers would stop if they arrived too late for evening entry. The administrative centres are sited where they could maintain visual contact with the castle gate.
Long after the drawbridges stopped operating, the urban geography they created remains legible to anyone who knows how to read it. Consider the town of Conwy in Wales, which developed around Edward I's massive castle. The original drawbridge schedule at Conwy created a rhythm of access that shaped where different activities located themselves. Merchants who needed frequent castle access clustered near the gate. Craftsmen whose work wasn't castle-dependent located further away, where rents were lower. The wealthy, who could afford to live close enough to respond quickly when the bridge went down, occupied the premium locations. This socio-economic geography, created by the drawbridge schedule, remained fixed even after the castle ceased to function as a governing centre. The property values in modern Conwy still reflect these medieval patterns to some degree. The areas near the old castle gate command higher prices than equally attractive areas further away. Locals sometimes attribute this to tradition or prestige, and they're right, but the tradition and prestige trace back to practical medieval realities. Proximity to the drawbridge meant economic advantage. That advantage calcified into social status. That status persisted as property value. The angle of a medieval bridge still affects who can afford to live where in a 21st century Welsh town. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. We've travelled from the engineering of hinges to the economics of urban geography, all through the lens of one simple architectural decision, the angle of a drawbridge. If this story has changed how you see the physical spaces around you, how you recognize the intentions embedded in design choices, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and share your thoughts. What buildings in your own environment shape your behavior in ways you hadn't noticed? What slopes and angles do you climb without thinking about why? I read every single comment. Now let me bring this story to its conclusion, because the genius of the drawbridge angle points towards something larger than medieval engineering. The quiet rules that drawbridges enforced didn't disappear when the bridges became obsolete. They transformed into other forms of social regulation, often carried forward by people who had no idea of their origins. The expectation that visitors should announce themselves and wait for permission to enter. This was once encoded in the drawbridge mechanism itself, which required someone inside to operate it. When drawbridges gave way to ordinary gates and then to open entrances, the social expectation remained. We still knock before entering. We still wait to be admitted. We still treat crossing thresholds as transitions that require permission. The deference built into the climbing approach also persisted in transformed forms. We still design important buildings so that visitors approach them by ascending, climbing steps to courthouses, walking up to legislative chambers, ascending to religious spaces. The association between climbing and respect, between elevation and authority, may have roots that predate medieval drawbridges, but the drawbridge angle certainly reinforced and transmitted this association. Every time a medieval visitor climbed a drawbridge incline, they were being taught that approach to power involves physical ascent. The timing rules of the drawbridge also left traces in later social organization. The idea that certain spaces are available only during certain hours, that there are times for access and times for exclusion, became deeply embedded in European social practice. Business hours, office hours, visiting hours, all of these reflect the fundamental logic of the drawbridge schedule. The bridge goes down in the morning and up in the evening. Within those hours, business can be conducted. Outside them, you must wait. This temporal structuring of access, once enforced by mechanical necessity, became social expectation. The metaphorical language we use about access and exclusion often echoes drawbridge imagery. We speak of raising the drawbridge when we want to exclude outsiders. We describe welcoming communities as having lowered the bridge. We use gated community as a term even when actual gates aren't present.
The drawbridge became a symbol so powerful that it outlived its physical referent, continuing to shape how we think and speak about social boundaries long after the last functional drawbridge was raised for the final time. This symbolic persistence reveals something about how human cultures transmit information across generations. The practical knowledge of how to build and operate drawbridges was lost as the technology became obsolete, but the social patterns that drawbridges created were more durable because they were encoded in behavior rather than explicit knowledge. You didn't need to know why you waited for permission to enter. You just did it because everyone did it. The behavior reproduced itself without requiring the technical knowledge that originally created it.
The mechanisms of this behavioral transmission are fascinating. Children learned by watching adults navigate spatial hierarchies. Newcomers to communities learned by observing how established members approached important buildings. The physical environment provided constant cues that reinforced the patterns. You didn't need a teacher to tell you that approaching the castle involved climbing. The slope itself taught you. This kind of environmental pedagogy is remarkably effective because it's continuous and consistent, operating every time anyone interacts with the space.
Modern architects and urban planners increasingly recognize this pedagogical function of built environments. The field of environmental psychology studies how spaces affect behavior, with applications ranging from crime prevention to public health promotion. But medieval builders understood this intuitively, even if they lacked the scientific vocabulary to describe it. The drawbridge angle was environmental psychology avant la lettre, a design decision made to produce specific behavioral outcomes.
The ethical dimensions of this architectural influence deserve consideration. When we design spaces that shape behavior, we're exercising a subtle form of power over the people who use those spaces. The lord who specified a steep drawbridge angle was imposing his preferences on everyone who wanted to enter his castle. He was making a decision about how others should feel and act, encoded in stone and timber rather than in laws or commands. This raises questions about who has the right to make such decisions and who should bear the consequences.
The medieval answer to these questions was straightforward. The lord owned the castle and could build it however he wished. Visitors who didn't like the approach could stay away. This answer seems inadequate from a modern perspective because it ignores the power imbalances that made castle access necessary for many people. The merchants who complained about steep drawbridge angles couldn't simply take their business elsewhere. The castle was the economic centre of the region. Accepting the angle with all its inconveniences and humiliations was the cost of participating in economic life.
We face analogous issues today. The designers of airports, shopping malls, office buildings and public spaces make decisions that shape how millions of people move and feel. These decisions are made by relatively small groups of architects, developers, and institutional clients. The people who actually use the spaces rarely have meaningful input into their design. The quiet rules of modern architecture, like the quiet rules of medieval drawbridges, are imposed rather than negotiated.
Consider the modern shopping mall, which is engineered to produce specific behaviors just as deliberately as any medieval drawbridge. The placement of anchor stores at opposite ends encourages walking past smaller shops. The absence of windows eliminates time queues, extending shopping duration. The curved sightlines create a sense of exploration that keeps people moving. These design features aren't accidental. They're the product of research into consumer behavior, implemented to increase sales. The mall's architecture shapes its visitors, just as the drawbridge angle shaped medieval travelers.
Or consider the modern workplace, where open-plan offices were supposedly designed to encourage collaboration, but often seem to encourage anxiety and distraction instead. The design decisions that create these spaces, the sight lines, the acoustic properties, the arrangement of private and public areas, all shape employee behavior in ways that serve some interests and disserve others. The question of whose interests should prevail in these design decisions is rarely asked explicitly, just as it was rarely asked explicitly when medieval lords specified drawbridge angles.
The genius of the drawbridge angle in this light is not just mechanical, but political. It solved a mechanical problem in a way that also solved a political problem, creating deference and controlling access through physical means rather than explicit commands. This dual function made the drawbridge an extremely efficient instrument of power. You didn't need guards at the bridge constantly enforcing behavior. The bridge's design enforced behavior automatically. You didn't need to explain to visitors that they should feel subordinate. The climb communicated the message directly to their bodies.
The combination of mechanical necessity and social function that characterized the drawbridge angle appears in many other medieval technologies. The narrow spiral staircases in castle towers, which forced attackers to fight upward with their sword arms against the wall, also created hierarchies of access within the household. The great hall's orientation toward the high table, which optimized sight lines for the lord, also optimized social deference. Medieval builders were masters of this dual optimization, solving practical problems in ways that simultaneously reinforced social structures.
This mastery didn't require conscious theorizing. The builders who specified drawbridge angles weren't writing treatises on the social psychology of architecture. They were solving practical problems using accumulated craft knowledge, and the solutions that worked best were those that addressed multiple problems simultaneously. A bridge angle that spared the hinges, speeded operation, and created appropriate visitor deference was more likely to be replicated than one that only achieved one of these goals. Natural selection among design solutions favored multifunctional optimization.
The loss of this multifunctional design wisdom is one of the subtle costs of modernity. Our specialized approach to building separates structural engineering from social psychology, mechanical function from user experience. Different specialists optimize for their own goals, and the integration that medieval builders achieved intuitively has to be consciously reconstructed, if it's achieved at all. The drawbridge angle was genius, precisely because it emerged from a design process that didn't separate these functions. What might we learn from this medieval integration? Perhaps that physical design is always social design, whether we acknowledge it or not. Every slope, every sightline, every threshold communicates something about who is welcome and on what terms. The question isn't whether to shape behavior through architecture, but how to do so consciously and ethically. The medieval builders shaped behavior to reinforce the power of lords. What would it mean to shape behavior toward other goals? Democracy, equality, community, flourishing. Some modern architects have attempted this reorientation. The universal design movement tries to create spaces that accommodate all users, regardless of physical ability. Crime prevention through environmental design attempts to reduce criminal opportunity by shaping sightlines and access patterns. Biophilic design incorporates natural elements to promote psychological well-being. These approaches recognize the behavioral power of architecture and try to direct it toward broadly beneficial ends. They are, in a sense, descendants of the drawbridge angle, updated for democratic rather than feudal values.
The drawbridge itself has become a symbol in contemporary discourse, usually invoked negatively. To raise the drawbridge is to exclude, to withdraw,
to prioritize the safety of those inside over the needs of those outside. Brexit was often described in drawbridge terms, with critics accusing Leave voters of wanting to raise the drawbridge against Europe. Immigration debates globally use similar imagery. The drawbridge has become shorthand for a certain kind of defensive, exclusionary mindset.
This symbolic use is interesting because it captures something real about the original drawbridge function. The medieval drawbridge was defensive and exclusionary. It was designed to protect those inside from threats outside. The angle that spared the hinges was also the angle that maintained the possibility of rapid exclusion. When we use drawbridge imagery today, we're tapping into this deep association between physical design and social boundary making. The medieval technology provides a vocabulary for contemporary debates about who belongs where.
But the drawbridge was also, in its time, an instrument of connection. When lowered, it enabled trade, communication, governance, all the activities that made medieval civilization possible. The same mechanism that could exclude could also welcome. The same angle that made raising efficient made lowering efficient too. The drawbridge embodied the fundamental ambivalence of all boundaries. They separate. Separation is what makes meaningful connection possible. Without the ability to close, the opening means nothing.
This ambivalence is worth sitting with as we conclude. The drawbridge angle was genius because it served multiple functions, some of which are in tension with each other. It protected and excluded. It connected and controlled. It spared hinges and shaped behavior. It solved mechanical problems and enforced social hierarchies. Any attempt to reduce it to a single meaning misses the complexity that made it work. The genius was precisely in this multifunctionality, this ability to serve different needs simultaneously.
The same might be said of the best design in any era. The solutions that persist, that get replicated and refined across generations, are those that address multiple problems at once. Single-function designs are always vulnerable to being replaced by something that does the one function better. Multifunction designs create their own niches, becoming indispensable because they serve needs that nothing else addresses in quite the same way. The drawbridge angle was one such multifunction solution. Its genius lay not in any single optimization, but in the constellation of optimizations it achieved together.
The drawbridges are gone now, mostly. A few survive as museum pieces or tourist attractions, their mechanisms reconstructed for demonstration rather than defense. The castles they protected have become heritage sites, their military functions forgotten, their social hierarchies dissolved. But the angles remain, frozen in stone approaches and embedded in cultural memory. The quiet rules the drawbridges enforced have become so naturalized that we no longer recognize them as rules at all. We knock before entering. We wait to be admitted. We understand that access can be granted or withdrawn. The drawbridge taught us these things, and we remember the lessons, even after forgetting the teacher.
Perhaps this is the truest form of genius, to solve a problem so thoroughly that the solution becomes invisible. The drawbridge angle is invisible now, a slope we climb without thinking about why slopes exist in approaches. The medieval engineers who calculated that angle, who balanced mechanical stress against social function, who refined their craft across generations of practice, they would be pleased, I think, to know that their work outlasted its purpose. They built for defense against immediate threats. They left behind something more permanent, a way of thinking about how physical spaces shape human behavior.
We are all, in various ways, climbing drawbridge inclines still. The physical environments we inhabit are full of decisions made by people we'll never meet, for purposes we may never understand. These decisions shape our behavior in ways we rarely notice. The awareness that began with the drawbridge angle, the recognition that physical design is social design, is a tool for seeing what's usually invisible. Once you know to look for the angle, you start seeing it everywhere.
The genius of the drawbridge angle wasn't just mechanical or social or political, it was educational. It taught generations of medieval people how to approach power, how to negotiate access, how to understand their place in hierarchies. It taught modern scholars how physical design encodes social intention, and it can teach us, if we let it, how to read the quiet rules written into the spaces we inhabit every day.
The bridge is down now. You can cross if you choose, but notice as you go that you're still climbing. The angle remains, and the angle still has things to say.
Good night.